Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. To get access to all the research that I use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Welcome to this week's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. Last episode, we spoke about gestational diabetes screening and the issues that are inherent with that. And today we're continuing our topic of gestational diabetes and speaking with world-renowned dietitian and nutritionist Lily Nichols about the information that she shares in her book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and ways to control and manage diabetes based on the food that you eat. And this is not the mainstream information that you'll be getting from your usual diabetes educator. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition. Her work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and critical of outdated dietary guidelines. She's the founder of the Institute for Perinatal Nutrition, the co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and the author of 3 books, Real Food for Fertility, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily's best-selling books have helped thousands and thousands of women and babies, and they're used at university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses, and have even influenced perinatal nutrition policies internationally. You can find out more about Lily in the show notes. And today we're specifically speaking about her work on gestational diabetes, drawing on the content from her book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Thanks, Lily, for being here.
Love it. Thank you for having me.
All right, I've got a list of questions and I'm just going to launch straight in. So can you start us off with what is gestational diabetes and why do women get it?
Sure. So gestational diabetes is when your blood sugar is elevated above what we consider normal during pregnancy specifically, hence the term gestational, meaning in pregnancy. There's some different ways to define it. By some definitions, it's diabetes that's first develops during pregnancy. It's something it wasn't going on beforehand. This is a result of physiological changes that happen to the body in pregnancy. The other definition is that it is elevated blood sugar that is first recognized during pregnancy. So yes, it's first diagnosed, but it does not mean that it is entirely due to maternal physiological changes. It can indeed stem from pre-existing blood sugar insulin regulation issues, and we're happening to catch it during pregnancy. And so there's quite a few women who simply have never had their blood sugar checked, and then it comes out high during pregnancy. You kind of don't know for sure, is this truly just the result of pregnancy itself, or was it something going on preconception?
What are the changes that happen in a woman's body that would make them diabetic in pregnancy when they weren't normally diabetic?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that change in pregnancy. So first of all, our insulin production changes. And if all goes as planned, you produce more insulin in order to overcome the fact that in later pregnancy, your body is a bit insulin resistant, meaning it takes more insulin to bring your blood sugar into a healthy range. If all adaptations go as planned, this is no big deal. You still maintain blood sugar in a healthy range. You're just doing so with higher levels of insulin. Somebody who's coming into pregnancy with quite a bit of insulin resistance, that becomes really difficult for their body because they're already pumping out high amounts of insulin. So sometimes that shows up as gestational diabetes. You have weight gain over the course of pregnancy, which is a natural and necessary thing for at least the majority of pregnancies, but that can make you more insulin resistant. There are changes in your placental hormones that affect insulin resistance. And then there's other things that can happen as well, like just disrupted sleep from being kind of uncomfortable, hard to find the right position, or, pregnancy insomnia is legitimately a thing that can affect it. And finally, if there's low nutrient intake or overt nutrient deficiencies, that can also play a role.
And you talk about gestational diabetes as being a kind of carbohydrate intolerance. You know, I'm a private midwife, and on occasion, my clients will test positive to having gestational diabetes. And then when they go and see the dietitian or the nutritionist or endocrinologist gives them this diet that seems so high in carbohydrates. And I first trained as a naturopath. And when I first saw the diet that they were giving women, I was very confused because it seemed counterintuitive to give somebody who's having trouble digesting and processing carbohydrates and sugars a high carbohydrate diet. Can you talk to us about what women can expect to be told to do with their diet if they've been diagnosed with gestational diabetes and then they're off to see their diabetic educator or dietitian or whoever it is through their hospital? What will they usually get told to do in order to control it with diet?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting world we live in. And I'm glad you brought up another alternative definition of gestational diabetes, which I usually also like to bring up: carbohydrate intolerance. Your body cannot tolerate a large bolus of carbohydrates in one sitting without experiencing high blood sugar. That's what carbohydrate intolerance means. So yeah, it is perplexing. And many times I have faced that same, like, this doesn't actually make sense because you took a glucose tolerance test of 50, 75, 100 grams of glucose, and now your meal plan has essentially 50 or sometimes 60, 75 grams of carbohydrates at each meal. So if you failed the test, meaning your blood sugar was too high after that quantity of glucose, why would we give you the same amount of carbohydrates and expect a better result? It's it's truly a bit nonsensical. So yeah, there's all sorts of reasons the guidelines are what they are. And I mean, I'm the first to point out all the flaws with those recommendations. And I've written very extensively about this topic because that advice doesn't help to control blood sugar for the majority of women. Sometimes if you have somebody with a really mild case, you give them a meal plan that spreads the high carbohydrate intake evenly across the day, and it works. But for the majority, it does not work. It's too many carbohydrates for their body to tolerate at one sitting without experiencing high blood sugar. And then they get on the path towards medication or insulin, which otherwise may not have been necessary if they simply ate a more appropriate level of carbohydrates for what their body's tolerance is. So the typical diet that you'll usually expect to get from a clinic or hospital has a mandatory minimum of no less than 175 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that's typically split across 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks. Usually it's 3 snacks because they want you to have a bedtime snack before you go to sleep. And everything else basically falls in line with the dietary guidelines. So low fat, low cholesterol, low salt, moderate to minimal amount of protein, and emphasis on vegetables, of course, as all of our guidelines have. And then this fairly large carbohydrate intake. Most of the focus is on getting the consistent amount of carbohydrates between each meal and a slightly smaller quantity, but a still consistent quantity of carbohydrates at each snack. And the idea is that if we're not giving you all of these carbohydrates at one time, we're going to minimize the blood sugar spikes. And again, that's all well and good if you have a mild case, but for somebody who is much more carbohydrate intolerant, it is just far too many carbohydrates for their body to tolerate. So to have a breakfast with 30 grams of carbohydrates and a lunch with 45 or 60 grams of carbohydrates is too much for their body. And that necessitates medication or insulin. Whereas if we just brought the carbohydrates down even a little bit, you don't always necessarily have to restrict as much as people think, you may be able to avoid that intervention altogether.
So the rationale is that they're saying that women need carbohydrates through their pregnancy, and let's pace them out through the day to try and maintain a stable blood sugar. But then they've disregarded all the other nutrients that are required to maintain blood sugar. And that's something in your book you talk about other ways of balancing blood sugar. So what do you mean by real food for gestational diabetes? I suppose the other question of that is, what's the fake food for gestational diabetes?
Yeah. So the concept of real food, everybody has their own definitions. For me, like the whole reason that I started on this process of writing all these books about nourishing your body during pregnancy and focusing on whole foods or real foods is because so often our emphasis in the conventional nutrition world is just calories and macronutrients and food exchanges and getting this food group or that food group, and that's it. And when it comes to something like maintaining your blood sugar in a healthy range in pregnancy, it isn't just about macronutrient balance. Your body also needs all these other micronutrients, vitamins and minerals for your blood sugar balance, for your insulin production and release, for glucose utilization. And so if you're only focused on calories, but your diet is made up of a bunch of processed foods, you still may not have optimal results. So for me, my definition of real food is focusing on foods that are primarily single ingredient foods, or if it's a multi-ingredient item, the ingredient list is simple and anybody can read it. It's not filled with a bunch of chemicals and things that you can't even pronounce or couldn't recreate in your own kitchen. And so it's just whole foods, right? Your fruits, your vegetables, poultry, meat, dairy, eggs, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains. I mean, the whole gamut of whole foods, while limiting as much as you can the ultra processed items. So when we've taken components out of a food, like we've isolated corn syrup out of corn, it is no longer a whole food that no longer has its micronutrient makeup. That falls into the category of ultra processed foods. So the primary things I'm looking at trying to displace by having people eat more of the whole stuff is by eating more of the whole stuff, you'll fill up on nutritious foods and you will hopefully eat less refined sugars and corn syrup and refined white flour and ingredients like that that are not really giving your body the sustenance that it's looking for. Sure, they give you calories, but they don't keep you very full. They don't really nourish you, and they certainly dysregulate your blood sugar a lot.
And so what alternative do you offer to the high carb diets that are offered in mainstream care for diabetic women? What kind of diet regime are you suggesting for women who have got gestational diabetes?
Well, first and foremost, the concept that you need a certain amount of carbohydrates per day is a misnomer. There's a whole chapter in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes going through where that concept even came from and why it's based around a lot of incorrect assumptions. So my approach is to match the carbohydrate intake to a level that matches a woman's carbohydrate tolerance. So watch your blood sugar levels. Most of the time you'll get prescribed a home blood sugar meter and test out different meals with varying amounts of carbohydrates and combinations of foods until you hit a combination that is not causing hyperglycemia after the meal. So eat to the meter is another way of describing it. So oftentimes this looks like reducing the carbohydrate intake from the standard by maybe a portion or 2 portions per meal. It absolutely just depends on the case. There's a very, very wide range of carbohydrate tolerance, but I give women the permission to make that choice and to take ownership over the diagnosis. Now, anytime you're reducing your intake of some foods, you're also now reducing your calorie intake, and you need to be getting enough energy from elsewhere. So I also educate on what are the foods that don't raise your blood sugar. That's kind of how I have it split up in the Real Food for Gestational Diabetes book, because that's honestly how I taught this in practice for a really long time. And it just works. It makes sense for people's brains. So your protein, your fat, your non-starchy vegetables. So basically anything other than like starchy potatoes and starchy corn, most of your vegetables, they're not going to raise your blood sugar a whole lot. So if you're reducing your carbohydrate intake, say you normally have, I don't know, eggs and toast and fruit at breakfast, and you've now taken away some of the toast or some of the fruit and you're only left with the eggs, well, you've cut out a bunch of calories. So now you have to add more back. So are you going to add an extra egg? Are you going to add some vegetables and make an egg vegetable scramble? Are you going to maybe switch out your bread for something that's slightly lower carb, lower glycemic? You have to fill in the void with more food. And that is the biggest mistake that I see made when women get diagnosed with gestational diabetes, especially if they're only given the conventional advice. They try out their sample meal plan that's super high carb. They start seeing high blood sugar levels. They freak out. They over-pathologize the situation. And the only thing they know to do is to just restrict their food. They don't know that you could just add an extra serving of protein and fat and vegetables or nuts and seeds to that meal and be able to eat to satiety, stay full, feel good, have energy without having high blood sugar. And so that's an important component. They just see all food as oh my gosh, all food is going to raise my blood sugar. They're really not educated. Or if they are educated on, carbs raise your blood sugar, but you have to have this amount, there's this terrible fear instilled on them that if they reduce their carbohydrate intake, they're going to harm their baby's development, which is incorrect information. That is just wrong information. We actually see when you look at a dietary intake and micronutrient intake, we see the best micronutrient intake among women who have the lowest refined carbohydrate intake. So my approach is very different.
I wanted to ask about healthy ways to eat carbohydrates for women who are diabetic. How can they address their carbs and consume them without creating a blood sugar spike?
It's a necessary conversation. And it is crazy when you start picking at nutrition with any little thing, it affects everything else. So if you start delving into, okay, well, we're eating fewer carbohydrates. Okay, well, you look at the proportion of the diet coming from different macronutrients, you're by default going to have to see increases in protein and fat intake to offset it. Protein intake can only go so high. So there's a substantial increase in fat intake, and that freaks people out. So it's a whole other rabbit hole of de-education. As for the hacks for how can you consume carbohydrates without experiencing high blood sugar? Again, at some level, the quantity of carbohydrates consumed ultimately determines how high your blood sugar is going to go. A lot of people think about it in terms of oh, well, if I combine my foods, eat protein with my carb, then it cancels out the carb. Nothing cancels out the carb, but you can reduce the blood sugar spike by upwards of 30 to 40% by eating them in combination with other foods. So highest glycemic response, biggest blood sugar spike would come from eating carbohydrates by themselves, especially if it's very refined. So pure sugar, white bread. White bread actually has a very similar glycemic response to white sugar. So same, whether it's white flour or white sugar, they both spike your blood sugar like crazy. And then you start getting into the slightly less processed carbohydrate. Maybe it's a whole wheat bread. Maybe even better, it's a whole wheat sourdough. Maybe even better, it's a whole wheat sourdough that has some sprouted grains in it. So the starch is still inside the grain that you have to chew, and then your body has to break down and digest before the glucose is released. You can reduce the blood sugar spike by choosing better quality, less processed carbohydrates. Another good example is juice versus fruit. The juice will spike your blood sugar actually very similar to a soda. And I know that's what? You're saying juice is soda? Of course, there's other nutrients in juice. But from a blood sugar perspective, your blood sugar spike can actually be just as bad from orange juice as it is soda. But if you were to sit down and peel an orange and eat an orange, A, you're slowed down by the peeling process. And B, there's fiber. It takes time. You have to chew it. You can't like drink it down in one sitting. So a little like 16-ounce bottle of juice has the equivalent carbohydrates to like 4 oranges. But you probably won't be able to eat 4 oranges in one sitting because you'll be full from all the fiber. So the less processed carb, better. Now, on top of that, you want to think about what are you combining your carbohydrates with? So anytime you're consuming your carbohydrates with something that has protein, fat, or fiber, having the less processed carbohydrate hits on the fiber component, but usually you also want to be thinking about adding protein or fat. You will reduce the blood sugar spike experienced after the fact. Even more so if you eat your fiber, if it's separate, fat and protein in advance of eating the carbs. So let me give you an example. You're going to sit down to a meal that has broccoli and steak and mashed potatoes. If you filled up on more of the broccoli and steak before you eat the majority of your potatoes, you will have a lower blood sugar response after that meal than if you sat down and ate all the mashed potatoes first and then went to the broccoli and steak. So those are things that can make a surprisingly big difference, especially if somebody is just really sensitive to carbohydrates. And I mean, I would like you to have as much variety as possible as well. Then we can start working with the combinations and the order in which your foods are consumed. And sometimes that can make a big difference.
I think we're so trained out of fats and proteins that we actually haven't really been taught about which proteins and which fats are actually good for our bodies, because for so long we've been told don't eat too much fat and limit animal products. Can you give some suggestions about daily healthy protein options that are easy to incorporate into your diet once you've removed some of the carbs and you're trying to find a way to fill those gaps?
Yeah, and this, depending on who's listening, I might sound like a total heretic with what I'm about to say, because you probably are going to expect me to respond with like all plant protein options. And I have no qualms with having some of those too. I think we need a balance of both. But arguably, meat has been unfairly demonized for many decades. And as I've gotten further in my career and more bold with what I write about, I've dissected this in like a lot of detail, especially my latest book, Real Food for Fertility, which has a whole chapter on vegetarian and vegan diets and considerations for the nutrients you're getting from those foods. So if you're still coming from the paradigm that meat is bad for you, egg yolks are bad for you, dairy fat is bad for you, and I should choose margarine instead of butter, everything I'm about to recommend will sound insane. So just, bear with me. I've addressed this in many places elsewhere. So I recommend a variety of protein-rich foods. Like I said, some of them can be plants, certainly, but you really do need to be getting some animal foods as well. So we're looking at meat of any kind, red meat or not, poultry, fish, seafood, shellfish, dairy products. I actually prefer high-fat dairy products. Of course, with any of these animal foods, the quality, like how they're grown and raised, can impact their nutritional value to some degree. And also like what other things might be in the products, hormones, antibiotic residues, pesticide residues, whatever. So if it's within your budget and availability to choose, grass-fed, pasture-raised animal foods, wild-caught fish and seafood are something that I recommend. If it's not within your budget, just even conventional is going to provide you a ton of micronutrients and your protein and fat that you need for blood sugar stability. So don't let the quality thing prevent you from consuming an adequate amount of them. Eggs with the yolks, absolutely fantastic. A lot of people have been scared away from consuming whole eggs for decades due to incorrect information being given out on dietary cholesterol. It's now been extremely well documented that dietary cholesterol does not impact your blood cholesterol levels, and most of the micronutrients in the egg are in the yolk, including some really key ones for babies' brain development, like choline, vitamin B12, DHA. So definitely eat the eggs. When it comes to dairy products for women with gestational diabetes, sometimes they do better choosing the higher protein, lower carb dairy products because liquid fluid milk and regular yogurt, they both have a significant amount of lactose, which is milk sugar, and that can raise your blood sugar. So sometimes women with gestational diabetes do better by having more like cheese, cottage cheese, Greek yogurt than they do drinking a whole bunch of milk, for example. So you might want to play around with that a little bit. Nuts, seeds, legumes can also be a good source. You do have to be considerate in terms of gestational diabetes with legumes because they also contain carbohydrates. And so they tend to be a pretty low glycemic carbohydrate source because they have protein, because they have fiber, but you still might want to have them in combination with some other foods at that meal to keep your blood sugar stable. It's all great on paper. They're low glycemic, and you work with enough clients and you do see very different blood sugar responses to different foods. And I have had clients where beans and lentils are actually a pretty significant contributor to their blood sugar spikes. So I did just want to mention that in case anybody experiences that. You're not alone, even though generally they work well for most people.
And even things like avocados. How do you feel about coconut oil?
Oh yeah, I kind of touched on the protein, but I didn't really go hard on the fats here. So yeah, avocados and avocado oil I'm a fan of, olives and olive oil. Nuts and seeds they also provide fat. They have protein, fat, and fiber. If you're doing nut oils, like a macadamia nut oil or an almond oil or something like that, you do want to be cautious that it's cold pressed, like extra virgin, because the fats in them are pretty delicate. I'm a big fan of coconut oil, big fan of also cooking with animal fats. So again, I feel like I'm here just like throwing all these things out that sound probably crazy to somebody not familiar with this, but our concept of healthy fats is also completely backwards per the guidelines. So we've all been told, eat more unsaturated fats, have your canola oil, have seed oils or vegetable oils because they're low in saturated fat and therefore they are healthier. Well, you actually look at what is the body's response to these fats. These unsaturated fats are very easily damaged. And when they become damaged, they can fuel inflammation and oxidative stress in our bodies. And I can tell you, they also can be an absolute mess for regulating blood sugar levels as well. Whereas saturated fats are very stable. Most of the fats and animal fats are saturated or monounsaturated, and they are much more protected against oxidative damage and going rancid. So that actually makes them a better choice for cooking oils. Now, different people do better with different levels of dietary fat. And I think what surprises people is when they hear me talking about eating more fat, I think people interpret that as like adding a whole lot of extra fat to what you're consuming. And while yes, I do want you to cook with some fat when you're cooking and dress your salad with a full fat dressing. The low fat ones are all super high in sugar. They're a mess and full of chemicals. So like real salad dressing with high quality oils and fats, yes. But you don't have to eat like stick upon stick of butter just to like hit your fat intake. If we simply start approaching food from the perspective of not taking the fat out of everything obsessively, and then cooking with a moderate amount of fat when we're preparing food so it doesn't stick to the pan and gives it some flavor, you're set. You really don't have to like add mass quantities. So, you know, I just want to like level set on that because some people I think take it a little bit to the extreme. Just like, don't take the yolks out of your eggs, leave the fat in your dairy products, like leave the skin on your chicken, chill.
Well, I think what women were told for so long is that food with fat in them will make you fat.
Right.
But it's actually opposite. Too much carbohydrate is the more likely thing that's going to lead to weight gain. But that message hasn't filtered through yet. And so we still are frightened of fat in food, thinking that the result is going to be weight gain.
Yeah, no, and yes, that's a misconception that definitely needs to be put to rest. And we do tend to see the best metabolic benefits from, at the very least, a moderately low carb diet. Doesn't have to be ridiculously low, but moderately low carb, sufficient protein, and then your fat simply makes up the remainder of your caloric intake. And for me, I'm personally, rather than nitpicking all the numbers, even though I am capable of doing so as a dietitian, from a practical standpoint with clients and even how I approach eating is very much from a mindful eating perspective, where it's like, okay, we're trying to take this from making sure there's protein every time we sit down to a meal or snack. If we're having carbohydrates, specifically like high carbohydrate foods with that meal, have them as a sort of like small side dish versus the main event, right? Having the main event of a giant plate of pasta is inevitably blood sugar dysregulating. No matter how much protein and fat you put on top of it, if you're eating a giant bowl of pasta, it's going to be a lot. But you may be able to have, a small side of pasta with your meatballs and veggies and stuff and be perfectly fine. And listen to your body too, right? You have like two ways of checking in from a gestational diabetes component. You got the meter to check your blood sugar after the fact. And then you have your hunger and fullness cues, your mindful eating cues on how full do you feel, and titrating that to the right amount of food for any particular time that you sit down to eat. And I think that even that concept can feel very foreign and uncomfortable to people because so many of us have been raised under this idea that you have to like strictly control all the things. And especially for a lot of women, we've had the diet culture infiltration of limiting your calories or limiting your fat for all of these years. I mean, many of us grew up with mothers who were trying to do their best for their family, but like keeping the fat intake to a minimum. And it's a very different way to approach food.
It's occurred to me that you and I are aware of what a complex carbohydrate is versus a simple carbohydrate. And so, put simply, more simple carbohydrates are going to spike your blood sugar faster and more likely to spike your blood sugar. And a complex carbohydrate is probably going to offer a more sustained release of carbohydrate and potentially less of a peak in your blood sugar levels. But can you explain what the difference is between a simple carbohydrate and a more complex carbohydrate?
Well, it comes down to how much a food has been processed, typically. So there's different levels of processing that can affect sort of the chemical structure of the carbohydrates in the food. So the simpler the structure, that's really what the simple and complex is referring to, is like the chemical structure of the starch or the sugar. The simpler the structure, the quicker your body can break it down and release the glucose from it to raise your blood sugar. And the more complex carbohydrates, your digestive system has to do more work to break apart all these different components of the starch to get at the individual glucose molecules in the food. That's really the difference. So from the perspective of starchy whole foods, those tend to fall into the category of complex carbohydrates. So a whole grain would be something that falls into the complex carbohydrate category. But even the level of processing of that grain can affect the glycemic index of it, which is how much it's going to raise your blood sugar. So you can have a whole, oats are a good way to think about this. Okay, can have a whole oat groat, they call it, which is a whole like oat kernel, I guess. By the way, if you try to cook that, it'll take ages. Normally, the oats that we get are at the very least steel cut, where they have cross-cut the oat so that it'll cook a little faster. And even that, it's like a 45-minute saga of cooking oatmeal. Steel-cut oats, prepared all perfectly and soaked overnight and all the things, was like my default breakfast. Turns out even that doesn't work all that well for my blood sugar, but that's a step up from the next stage of processing, which is rolled oats, where they've taken the whole oat and they've rolled over it with rollers so it's flattened out. That cooks a little faster. And then you have like the quick cooking oats, and then you have the instant oats. Like each level of processing, even though technically all of them still fall in the category of a complex carbohydrate, the more processed they are, the easier it is for your body to get at the starch molecules and then break those apart into individual molecules of glucose, which ultimately will raise your blood sugar. So I've kind of moved away in my work from talking about simple and complex carbs because it doesn't capture the full picture of the blood sugar thing. And you have so many people who think that just because something is a whole grain, then it's perfectly fine. But once you've taken that whole grain and ground it into a flour, and now it is turned into a bread product by means of like an industrialized bread making process, which doesn't have a long fermentation time. It's just a quick rise yeast bread. Like it's a blood sugar bomb. It just raises your blood sugar super fast. Not to mention most of the commercial breads, they add sugar or corn syrup to it as well. So it's a mixed bag. And yet if you were to do something like you take that same flour, but you make a traditional sourdough where there is a long fermentation time, and I've written about this on my blog. If people want to go to my site, lilynicholsrdn.com, search sourdough, you'll see my blog talking all about the benefits of sourdough and also my method for making it at home. If you have a long, slow fermentation process, you can turn what would have been a high glycemic bread into a actually fairly low glycemic bread. And it tastes delicious, digests well. I mean, there's all sorts of benefits. I love my sourdough. So there can be a difference, but both the sourdough bread and the whole wheat bread, technically, you could call them a complex carbohydrate or a complex starch.
So basically then, it's more about how a food is processed that will determine how it gets digested and then what it does to your blood sugar, more so than the type of food.
Yes.
Yes. So what I was thinking of doing next is offering a food that a lot of women would be eating and asking if you could help with an example or an alternative food that people could swap it out for instead. That might help their blood sugar. All right. So it's a bit of rapid fire. So white rice.
At the very least, you could do brown rice but I want to level set here because even though the brown rice is a complex carb, you're getting almost equivalent carbohydrate intake and only 3 or so grams of fiber per cup. So a better solution on the rice would be simply a smaller portion, consuming it at the end of the meal. Or if your body's really carb sensitive, swap it out. I know it's not the same, but swap it out for cauliflower rice, which doesn't taste like rice at all. I know, but it can be a white fill-in for the rice at the meal.
What about quinoa? Would that as a rice alternative?
You can. I've seen really not super impressive blood sugar responses with swapping in quinoa. So quinoa, again, will have very similar amounts of carbohydrates per cup as rice. You do get more fiber, and it does have a few extra grams of protein per cup. So it can be an option, but I think in general, we have to be looking at these grains as something that is a very small side dish at the meal versus like, I could swap white rice for brown and everything's solved. I've seen identical blood sugar spikes from brown rice and white, and likewise quinoa.
So basically still going with that principle of eating to your blood sugar readings. So
correct.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So white rice, not necessarily a better option to have brown rice. How about, I think you've already answered this question, but store-bought packaged bread. What would be the alternative to going to the shop and picking up a loaf of bread in a package?
Hey, if your shop has sprouted whole grain bread or a traditionally fermented sourdough, you'll know it's a traditionally fermented sourdough if it just has roughly 3 ingredients. You just need flour, water, and salt, and you're there. Or you could, of course, make your own. Those would all be better options. There's also a whole bunch of low-carb bread recipe replacements that are made with things like egg whites. You could try some of those other alternative options or find a way to swap out the bread entirely. Again, some people are really carb sensitive and they do better with things like a lettuce wrap instead of a bun or a bread.
All right. Pasta. Do we still get to eat pasta?
You can cook it al dente, and that does help. I will say swapping it out for whole grain pasta is only moderately better for the blood sugar response. So I would try first cooking it al dente and see if that helps, and try to eat your protein option first, or at least build in a lot of protein with the pasta. You could do a legume pasta. They have pastas made from legumes or pulses. So there's chickpea or lentil pastas. Again, I'm not saying it's a one-to-one flavor replacement, but sometimes as part of like a pasta bake, they work just fine. Sometimes you can do a vegetable in place of pasta. Again, not saying it's going to be a replacement for taste and texture, but you can make zucchini noodles or zoodles. I have like a low-carb lasagna recipe where you use thin slices of zucchini, or you could do really thin slices of eggplant. So there's ways around it. I would say, like, again, how much do you need to cut back? Only cut back as much as you need to based on how your blood sugar response is. You can, of course, almost everybody can still do a small portion, but the concept of sitting down to this like giant plate of spaghetti, you might want to, rethink that. Or you can even do a combination, right? So you could do a combination of some regular spaghetti cooked al dente with some zoodles, and you're getting the best of both worlds, still some of the flavor and texture of the pasta, and the zucchini noodles are just kind of like there as a vegetable in noodle form.
All right. How about breakfast cereals?
I would do a grain-free granola for that, and I do have a recipe for that.
Beautiful. All right. People who put sweetener in their tea, or sugar in their tea or coffee, is there an alternative to that?
There's a whole host of options out there that you could do. I mean, first of all, sometimes it's just about reducing the quantity. So you may be able to get away with a little of the real thing, just reduce the quantity that you're having, and that may be perfectly fine. If you go for like a more natural sweetener, like honey or maple syrup, those will still give you the same amount of sugar as white sugar. I do like them. They have a nice flavor. They have like a teeny amount of some micronutrients in there. But be aware that if you swap for honey or maple syrup, it'll still raise your blood sugar. There are low sugar or sugar-free alternatives that are a bit more natural and less of the, aspartame, Splenda kind of thing. So you could do stevia-derived sweetener, you could do xylitol, you could do erythritol, monk fruit extract, you could do those. Those are all essentially sugar-free sweeteners. I'm going to throw out one that's kind of interesting, which is that there is a nutrient called inositol, which is a B vitamin-like compound, where we have quite a bit of research on it now in pregnancy. It's actually often used in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome to help with reducing insulin resistance. And inositol is something that's also been studied for supplementing in pregnancy to either reduce the risk of developing gestational diabetes or to improve treatment like success. Sometimes it can actually end up like reducing the need for requiring medication or insulin. Like it has a pretty profound effect. And inositol you can get in a powder form and it tastes sweet. So I actually use inositol to sweeten my tea, half teaspoon or so. And usually when you're looking at like a dosage, a clinically effective dosage for blood sugar improvement, you're looking at maybe a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half. So, you could put in a half teaspoon or so of inositol in your tea or coffee. It's a very mildly sweet flavor. It's not going to be exactly the same as sugar, but it is pleasant. It is not terrible tasting whatsoever. So that's another unconventional, doesn't fall in the sweetener category, but fills that role.
Yes. Excellent. So the last question I had for you is there a way with diet in pregnancy to actually prevent gestational diabetes in pregnancy? Yeah, by what you're
It's
eating.
the $1,000,000 question. And there isn't a perfect answer to this, because sometimes there indeed are, you have individuals who have almost no risk factors and they develop it. There are cases in which there's no predisposing factors and the body just really struggles to adapt to the pregnancy-induced insulin resistance, So I don't want to paint a picture that this is something that can definitely for sure be avoided if you just follow these 5 hacks, right? That said, we do have a lot of research on different options for helping to prevent gestational diabetes. First and foremost, the healthier you are coming into pregnancy, and by healthy, I mean like blood sugar and insulin levels in a healthy range, you're less likely to develop gestational diabetes in that subsequent pregnancy. So that is certainly something to work on, your blood sugar levels in advance of conception. Coming into pregnancy at a healthy weight likely helps. Coming into pregnancy as somebody who is physically active, and particularly if you're able to continue some amount of physical activity, even if what that looks like changes in pregnancy, still, even if it's just walking, that dramatically reduces the risk of developing it. Coming into pregnancy with decent micronutrient intake and nutrient stores, so good vitamin D levels, good magnesium intake, sufficient intake of B vitamins like thiamine and minerals like chromium. These things can help with blood sugar and insulin levels in addition. And if you do find that, say, your vitamin D levels are low, getting time in the sun and or supplementing with vitamin D until you can get those levels back up. We have data on pre-pregnancy vitamin D levels and incidence of gestational diabetes. We have data on supplementing with vitamin D during pregnancy to raise vitamin D levels up, and that reduces glucose levels. So there's a ton of research on vitamin D. That's another place I would focus on. And then I would say just one more thing that sounds a little random, but getting a sufficient amount of sleep can help with your blood sugar levels quite a bit. So building in healthy sleep habits from the get-go, not being on screens right before going to sleep, keeping the lights low, or even having a red light before bed, sleeping in the darkness, so have curtains that block out light if there's any light outside your windows. That actually has a surprisingly dramatic effect on blood sugar levels, and I don't want anybody with young children to feel like they're completely screwed, because I have 2 kids, been there. Sleep is disrupted, but doing the best you can to try to maintain a healthy sleep environment can go quite a long way. Oh, and I should mention food stuff. Food, what you're eating, makes a dramatic difference. So we see lower rates of gestational diabetes in women who are eating more protein, more fresh produce, less ultra-processed foods, less added sugars, less omega-6 fats, which come from your processed seed oils. So the better quality your diet is coming into pregnancy. And I know first trimester is you got a free pass, but as best you can, as your symptoms allow, eating a nutritious diet can play a role as well.
Yes. And I just had one other question that popped up as we were talking about it. There's some controversy about what classifies gestational diabetes, what blood sugar level is too high and then puts you in the range of diabetes. So here in Australia, there's some criteria where it says if your fasting glucose level when you wake in the morning is above 5.2, then that would count as too high. Others say 5.6 is too high. But do you have an opinion about the morning fasting blood sugar and what would be considered a too high reading?
I'm just calculating this out into milligrams per deciliter, because that's what we're doing in the US. So it depends on the criteria that are used for diagnosis. In Australia, are you doing the 75 gram 2-hour test performed fasting?
Yeah, 75 grams. So you go in fasting blood sugar and then 75 grams and then the 2 blood tests.
Okay. And they're using the criteria of 90. Well, you would convert it into millimoles per liter. But in the US, if you were to do the 75 gram 2-hour fasted glucose tolerance test in pregnancy, the numbers they're looking at are 92 fasting, 180 at 1 hour and 153 at 2 hours. And any reading that is above the threshold, so even if it's only the fasting reading, that's 93. That counts as a positive diagnosis for gestational diabetes. You'd be looking at 5.1 versus 5.2. But when it comes to the treatment goals for where is it optimal to maintain blood sugar levels, it sounds like what you're describing equated to approximately 94 milligrams per deciliter or 100 milligrams per deciliter. So when it comes to fasting blood sugar, there are some criteria that wants your fasting blood sugar below 90, which 90, that would equate to 5 millimoles per liter. There are others that want your fasting blood sugar below 95 milligrams per deciliter, which is about 5.2, 5.3 millimoles per liter. And there are others that want it only below 100, and that's 5.55, 5.6 millimoles per deciliter. And this is an active debate. So what I can tell you, as having worked with an organization known as the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, and also like practitioners who are in that IADPSG, International Association of Diabetes and Pregnancy Study Groups, they're the ones that set that 2 hour 75 gram glucose test criteria that you're describing. The reason that criteria was adopted as a diagnostic standard in many places is because it catches more cases of gestational diabetes. And we have data from over 23,000 pregnancies all over the world showing best outcomes for the baby when blood sugar is kept in a normal physiologic range in pregnancy instead of an arbitrary range. And that norm is keeping blood sugar below 90 milligrams per deciliter, or which would be below 5 millimoles per liter fasting. So I tend to subscribe to the err on the stricter side for blood sugar management, because when essentially what we want to be doing is mimicking what we see in an uncomplicated non-diabetic pregnancy. Those should be the blood sugar goals that we're aiming for. Because the data we have to date is that we have the least negative outcomes on baby's development, risk of complications, and also mom's future health by keeping blood sugar in a much stricter range. Now, there's a handful of caveats to this. And so I don't want to have somebody who's doing an excellent job with their blood sugar control during the day, but their fasting blood sugar is like 92 or 93, be freaking out that they're like ruining their baby's health for life. I think there's some nuance to this, because we have to remember like these goals are coming from an aggregate of tens of thousands of pregnancies. So you're going to have individual differences. So in cases where I'm not really sure how we're doing with this, what's going on with the fasting blood sugar, I've started using continuous glucose monitors so we can see what's happening with the blood sugar levels. You're getting, 200 plus like data points for the whole day instead of just a single time point fasted, a single time point after each meal, and trying to draw conclusions. Because I may have somebody whose blood sugar is actually pretty darn good, and it just starts spiking just a little bit as they're waking up, showing an elevated fasted reading, which conventionally we'd be like, oh no, their fasting blood sugar was high all night. But that actually wasn't the case for that person. And they actually don't need medication to lower it any further. We're just catching it at that dawn phenomenon time point when they're doing their finger sticks. So that was a really, really long answer to your question, but hopefully it helps.
It really does help. So take-home messages are that the conventional and mainstream approach to dietary care for women who have diabetes are generally too high in carbohydrates. Instead, women should eat to their glucose tolerance levels based on the results that they're getting from their blood sugar testing, whether or not they're using the continuous blood sugar testing or periodic, and that fats and proteins are your friend with controlling blood sugar levels, as well as all the micronutrients Did we miss any major points?
I think you covered it. And I can mention a few resources in addition to the book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I do have a free video series on gestational diabetes if you've just been diagnosed and like, what do I do? That video series is super helpful. That's up on my website, lilynicholsrdn.com. There's a little freebies tab. It's on there. I do have an online course on gestational diabetes. I've been running this for now 9 years. And that is a place where we dive into all sorts of additional nuances of things not necessarily covered in depth in the book, including like there's a 45 plus minute training on lowering fasting blood sugar, because that's the biggest challenge. And maybe you've seen that with clients where you can get their daytime readings within range, but the fasting blood sugar is like not budging. And that's something I have a lot of experience with, helping to guide people through the different types of patterns that can be observed and what to do depending on what's showing up for you. So you can check out the gestational diabetes course. All these things are linked out on my website, but also the realfoodforgd.com has that information. And yeah, do check my blog if you're just looking for free resources. Check my blog. There's hundreds of articles up there. Check my Instagram. Handle is Lily Nichols RDN. I post a lot of research there as well. And first steps, I'd say if you get a diagnosis is to like, don't freak out. It is manageable, and just know that some of the advice that you get conventionally might not really help your blood sugar. So grab a copy of Real Food for Gestational Diabetes so you can go into this with eyes wide open and know what sort of advice to take and what sort of advice to maybe take with a grain of salt. I wish everybody the best. I know it's a scary diagnosis, but it is something that sometimes has a silver lining. And a lot of times I'm hearing, actually, this was a blessing in disguise because I ended up having a healthier pregnancy despite the diagnosis. And like, I learned a heck of a lot about food and my body. And now I'm fueling myself better for years to come because of this scary thing that showed up in pregnancy. So I try to take you from the fear to that feeling as quickly as possible. I know it's a lot to take in.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the feedback that I get from my clients too, is that they're not grateful that they were diagnosed with gestational diabetes, but saw the opportunity to improve their health through better nutrition because of the diagnosis. And all of those resources that Lily just mentioned, they are in the show notes below, so you can click on through to the links and take advantage of all of that. Thanks so much, Lily, for being here.
You. My
Thanks
pleasure.
a lot. Beautiful. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.